most of what I've been doing for a while is what we call instrumentation or sensor development, new kinds of things to measure particles and measure the time structure of things and events and so on. So that's something we call time series. It means that you have information comes in at a fixed pace, and hidden in that information there may be signals. And at LHC, that's at Large Hadron Collider, that's very important for the future, because we've understood that you really have to disentangle things with time a little bit. But that's a whole it's a whole kind of discipline. I mean, they're the things you build to sense things, whether it's particles from the accelerator, or now we have this things that sense gravitational waves that come from outer space. But similar problems exist in neuroscience, of course. And the interesting thing in neuroscience is, how do you know that someone has onset of a disease, let's say Alzheimer's disease? Well, you give them a test, and they may pass the test, and then you ask them how do they feel about the test, and they'll say, I might have gotten the right answer, but I don't feel quite right. It just doesn't feel quite right the way I'm functioning. So this is called subjective cognitive impairment. And then you may do other things. You may take a sample of their blood or spinal fluid or any number of things, and find evidence for plaques or things that build up and affect the circulation and indirectly affect the functioning of the brain. Well, of course, what would be much nicer is if you could image the functioning of the brain, so it wouldn't be subjective, for example. And that would be very powerful, because if you could do that in an accurate way, you could figure out a way to cure somebody. You give them change of diet, or you give them a drug, or you give them exercise. You would see progress, and so directly imaging cognitive function sounds like a really great thing. And well, we don't do that today. What we do is we can do imaging like positron emission tomography, and normally when we do that we image sugar. Okay, what does that mean? Sugar means you're burning energy, it's metabolism, so it means there's activity somewhere. And indeed, you can lie someone on a couch and give them sugar which has a radioactive label in it, and then you tell them to think about music, and a certain part of their brain lights up, so it seems pretty good. But you're just figuring out like an area. It's called metabolism, not really imaging function. Then there's another thing that people do, also using positron emission tomography, where they've figured out how to image plaques. So this is something really probably does have to do with deterioration, and eventually Alzheimer's. But there's a million problems with that. One is, for example, in Switzerland, the laws about the exposure to radioactivity only allow you to do that twice a year. And so if you say, well, actually I need to do two things once, I need to do both the sugar imaging and I need to do the plaque imaging, well then you're done. You can't do anything more that year. And that's not very good if you're monitoring the progress of a patient. So it'd be nice to have other techniques, and the problem with the area that I'm interested in, called magnetoencephalography, which sees essentially the radio waves put out by the currents of nerves in your brain, is that it's not a mathematically solvable problem. In other words, you can't really can't write down the math how you would go from the radio signals and from the pickups around the head back to the image of what was going on in the brain. So the interesting thing in that field of magnetoencephalography is we've solved problems like that before that the mathematicians told you couldn't solve, and so it's a challenge. So that's why it's interesting. There are physicists who are not big fans of colliders. They think you should look out in the sky, and that maybe looking back the way the universe works and evolves and so on, you'll sort of get more quickly to the next step of understanding the basic constituents of matter. And of course they have a good argument, which is that most of the matter in the universe, we don't even know what it is. We just know about it from its effect in astronomical observations. It's called dark matter. It causes the properties of rotational curves in galaxies and many other things. So we learned about it, but we don't see any sign of it in our experiments in the collider. But of course, they both have the same goal, which is to understand, because understanding usually leads to advances in society and technology and even just general appreciation of our universe. The World Wide Web was invented at CERN. That's probably the biggest weapon that everybody's doing stuff, the Koreans, the Russians. So yeah, those tools are potentially put in the wrong hands a problem. You know, the other things, they don't really go the way people predict. For example, in the 80s, Reagan wanted to do something called Star Wars. And the killer weapon of Star Wars was going to be X-ray laser, which was powered by a nuclear bomb. Well, luckily we never did that expensive thing, but it turns out powering a laser with a nuclear bomb is pretty messy. But it turns out that we figured out other ways of making X-ray lasers without nuclear bombs, just slowly, and they're useful for stuff. But no, so far very little. I mean, everything is useful for weaponry if you're interested. You know, you make advances in computers, you make a better weapon, and so on. But none of this is like, you know, the Manhattan Project at all. Not at all.